I'm going to try to talk about predictors in drowning outcome and what Joost Bierens and I learned from a project, really hard project, that we were assigned 2 years ago. And so I'm going to talk about what we learned that was evidence-based about outcomes in drowning, and to also really address what we learned in the process of doing that about the quality of research and what information is out there and how we need to change. All right, so we have all been involved at our own level. I think that Kev was trying to say that with some of the mythology around drowning. We've inculcated it, some of us. We've continued to spout it, some of us. And some of us have tried to be mythbusters. All right, now let's see if I really know how to make this go. No. All right, so when we talk about outcome studies, they really have very specific components that you need to be thinking about, looking at when you ever hear about an outcome study. Because what one study finds about the predictors of outcome may not, as Kev alluded to and others have alluded to, may not apply to the population that you're dealing with, because we each and every one of us is dealing with a very specific population of people who are at risk for drowning or going to drown, or whom we're trying to treat. So who is a population is the first question, and what setting are they drowning in, and to an issue that the Coast Guard last night brought up, that there are certainly within even drowning, there are, if you will, at the very beginning, at the very top of the issue, there are two types. That's the intentional, that would be suicide or homicide, versus the unintentional. And most of us are involved with unintentional drowning prevention. Although I know John Connolly would like very much for us to focus at some point, and probably we should, about the suicide piece, which is a variable factor in different countries. So the intervention in an outcome study in this kind of a setting where we're talking about what are predictors, the intervention would actually be the predictor that we're talking about, and it would need to be compared to some other predictor in order to be useful in a study. And then, of course, there's the outcome. And as others have alluded to, we can talk about whether the victims lived or died, but we know that living is not just living, that there are several kinds of living, and that really what we should be talking about is survival with a good outcome, a favorable neurologic outcome, as opposed to survival with a devastated neurological situation, which is what actually happens in 1/2 to 2/3 of survivors of cardiac arrest from drowning. And then the other issue that I want you to be very careful about when you look at and read about outcome studies is who and when was that outcome determined? Because I, as a pediatrician, am horrified when people talk about outcomes at the scene. For instance, so if EMS is talking about well, gee, we made a save today, we brought that kid back. What EMS often doesn't know is they'll transport a child with a perfusing cardiac rhythm to the hospital, only to have that child will die in about 2 days of brain death. So what you see at the beginning is not what you see at the end. How far out is the end? When is the right time? We haven't really defined that yet, because most studies come from hospitals where they discharge the patient. And there aren't, I don't think, any ICU docs in here now, so I can say this. And that you don't want an ICU doc determining the outcome when you discharge somebody, because an ICU doc says, by gum, just like the paramedic, we saved that patient, he's breathing, he doesn't need a ventilator anymore. But is he going to go home and pay his taxes? Is he going to go to school? All right, so be careful. And so, in fact, some of the most famous cases that get brought up again and again, one from Salt Lake, that a child who got resuscitated after 60 minutes of being under, they wrote a paper and they said he went home normal. Well, he was only about 2 or so at the time. Well, I want my 2-year-old grandchild to do more than what he was able to do when they wrote their retraction 6 years later, when he was supposed to be going to school. And they had to say, we reported he was normal at discharge, but in fact, he was not. So the last piece is, and this is the piece that I want you to take home, because some of the other pieces various people have talked about through the day and are intuitive, if you will, is that when we talk about outcomes, we should be getting smarter, we need to be smarter about what are confounders. And if I get this wrong, William's going to correct me, that a confounder is a factor that influences both the likelihood that the drowning event happened and it affects the outcome. So that's not a clean connection. It's affecting everything, so it's not clean. So we need to know what those are. And so we're going to go look at what are the confounders that we know about that we really need to think about whenever we're talking about outcome of drowning. All right, now, this is hands up, so you have to do a little bit of motor activity to wake up after. We used to blame lunch, but it's actually not lunch. It's your diurnal rhythm that's making you fall asleep now. And that is, I want all of you to raise your hand who believe that age is a factor in outcome. So that most of us would like to say, a younger person, a child, is going to do better than, say, me who drowns. All right, next. How many think sex is a factor? Males are going to be more likely to survive. All right, how many think that race or ethnicity is a factor in outcome? Who survives? All right, how many think alcohol is a factor? A lot of people think so, and with good reason, because there have been good studies of that, showing the higher the alcohol level, less likelihood of survival. That 1 liter that you took, ooh, that was bad. All right, now, and then we heard today from the physiologists about prolonged QT, and then what I worry about is coronary artery disease. Am I going to jump in something cold and go into VF? And what about swimmability? Does that affect outcome? Many of us worry about that, spend our whole life trying to change that as a predictor. Is that an outcome predictor? How many people think so? Well, we haven't studied it, have we? How about being in an urban versus a rural setting? Are you more likely to survive if you have your drowning event in the city versus in the country? And what about water temperature? Does cold protect? Oh, put your hand up higher. Okay. And salt water, is that more protective than fresh water? People aren't sure. All right. What about if it was witnessed? Is that going to protect you? Isn't that why we say swim with a buddy? Something like that. There's some relationship in there. I'm not sure what it is, but we say swim with a buddy. Why is that? What about how long you've been submerged? How many people think that matters? A fair number of you. All right, what about bystander CPR? Does that matter? Does that improve your outcome? A lot of believers in that. And EMS response. If your response time is shorter, you're going to survive better? Yes, all right, and then there are scores. And then there are all the medical modalities, which we're not going to get into, because really we want to be looking at the rescue or decision making around the prediction issue of who's going to. And why is that? That's because, I'm sorry it doesn't say Royal Navy on this, because someone in this room sat down with a bunch of his, I won't say cronies, expert colleagues, and sat in a room and said, all right, guys, there were some women, right? Were there women on that committee? The committee where you went and made your recommendations for anyway, we'll get back to that whole issue because I'm always on your case about that. To make the decision, when should a rescuer make the decision to turn a drowning situation from a rescue to a body retrieval? Important issue, isn't it? Because that means putting William, Dan at risk, Kev at risk. That means using the Sikorsky that we heard about last night. Fun. So we have to be thinking about these things. All right, so Dr. Tipton and Golden got together a group in the UK to make a proposed decision-making guide for the search, rescue, and resuscitation of submersion victims. And he was very clear about that. That means you had to really have your head under, not immersion victims. And they admitted this was a guide based on expert opinion. And so they came up with this recommendation that if the water's warmer than 6 degrees centigrade, if it's warmer than that, then if it's true, then the search and resuscitation is extremely unlikely. Survival is extremely unlikely if the person has been submerged longer than 30 minutes. So that 30 minutes might be a guideline to consider. And that if the water is not warmer than, if it's less than 6 degrees, in other words, it's cold, truly cold, then the search and resuscitation for survival purposes would be extremely unlikely if the victim was submerged more than 90 minutes. So this was the first time that really such guidelines had been put into the literature, and there was a review, and Dr. Tipton and his group reviewed some papers for that, and so this was really a hallmark, an important issue to put before the resuscitation and rescue world. And so Gavin Perkins, Dr. Gavin Perkins from the UK, whom you heard about yesterday, talked about yesterday by John Long, Gavin's an extraordinarily smart physician, an ICU doc, and he put forth this question for the ILCOR resuscitation guidelines meeting to be reviewed in a systematic manner in order to really address the issue, not just of cold water hypothermia issues, but also identify really in the population of infants and children who are submerged in water, could we identify any particular factor in the search and rescue operation, such as submersion duration, salinity, water temperature, age of the victim, and we added to that EMS response time, and whether or not the event was witnessed, compared to not having, cold water, not being young, not being in salt water, being in fresh water. What factors changed the survival? And so he wanted us to look, or the ILCOR process wanted us to look at two kinds of outcomes. One, just did they live or die? And then did they live well after, or not live well and possibly die? And then they did something which was, again, really pushing us all to look at outcomes, not just at hospital discharge, but to hopefully find studies, and in the future do studies looking at those outcomes farther out, even up to a year out. So why did he do this? Why did Gavin put us to this task? And so I won't quote directly a comment from a very fine research epidemiologist at the University of Washington School of Global Health, He's a very polite man, and I heard this only secondhand, so I can't quote him directly, but he said the science of drowning is, and basically in your and my terms, flotsam and jetsam. And why is that? Because it's so much anecdotal case reports. It's so much retrospective, it's really all retrospective case series. And then they all involve skewed study populations, like their EMS studies. Well, what does an EMS study tell you about drowning? Because EMS is only going to take care of the patients they respond to. Well, what % of patients do they never see? Well, those are the ones who die at the scene, or when they get there, sometimes they declare dead, or when they get there and resuscitate and they decide they're dead, those don't maybe get into their EMS system. So they're leaving out huge chunks, important chunks of the drowning population. And then there's the hospital. Great majority of the drowning research is hospital-based. Well, what does that mean? These are patients who really had, to your point, physiologic or psychological survival skills, that they made it from the scene. They maybe were resuscitated by EMS, and they did make it into the ICU, and then things shut down, perhaps. And they died of the hypoxic and anoxic insult they had during their drowning later on. So those are very skewed populations. And then we have the inadequate outcome assessment that I alluded to before of ICU docs saying, oh yeah, he was normal when he left because the child could sit up. And then lack of follow-up. Fortunately, most of the people in this room belong to medical systems that actually have belong to nations that have medical systems. I, in the United States, do not belong to we do not have a medical health care system where we can follow up anybody. And so the last piece, and that is what we're going to talk about, is that the kind of analyses that have been done in these studies have rarely looked at what Kev talked about. The complexity, the interchange, the interaction between these various, quote, what we think are predictive factors, that it is a complex situation. And it's not just age that's going to determine outcome, that there are other aspects. But we haven't used in this, in our groups here, people who do research, the tools that are now becoming available that some of the people, hopefully, who are younger than I and Kev will take on to do with all the complex analyses that are becoming available, to throw things into the pot instead of assuming relationships are linear. All right, so this is what we had to do. I want you to feel very sorry for us. That means, since I don't drink beer, you could buy me an ice cream soda instead, and this is what Joost and I did. We had to go through 335 papers that were found by librarians on several searches for us, and then comb them down and make nightly calls. And he, of course, this was at 10 o'clock his time, which was then noon my time. Or 1 in the afternoon my time. We did that for weeks on end and literally put in hundreds of hours and categorized, after we selected these studies, and categorized them, as you see there in the column on your left, by the author and the date, the country, and then what was the study population, the sample size, the factors that they looked at. So in this, I've listed here the 4 studies that we ultimately found on water temperature and outcome that met our criteria, and what were the factors they used. Most of them actually gave defined temperatures, cutoffs, and only one did not use season, because in the Netherlands they can actually say in the winter the water is cold. There are others who questioned including that, so we had fights about that. We ranked them by the definition of outcome. Was it survival or neurologic quality. And then we had somebody smarter than us calculate the risk ratio, the likelihood that these victims who had this factor that was being considered in this group, water temperature, the likelihood that they would survive with a favorable outcome, and put these numbers all together. All right, and so that was our task. Actually, very easy. Then we had to get somebody much smarter than us, several people much smarter than us, to do something fancier with that. And so what we had them do is to do a meta-analysis. And so that is when you take these systematic reviews, which is what I just described to you on that sheet there, defining what kind of studies we were going to accept, where we could calculate those relative risks, the likelihood that they're going to have a good outcome based on their providing the data in the study and making it available to us, that then they could be combined. And so that we could do a meta-analysis, which is a method for combining pertinent data that's the same, relatively speaking, from several studies to develop a single conclusion. In other words, to put them all, pretend they were all one big study, sort of. And then it was able to give us, this meta-analysis, a quantitative analysis of these separate studies, and then we could look at the pooled data and check it for statistical significance. All right, here's what's cool about this meta-analysis system, is that it answers questions that sometimes individual studies weren't really looking at or seeking to answer, but they provided the data in their study for. So we could pick it out of the study. It settles controversies when there are conflicting studies. So some of you may say, oh, we know there are some studies that say age is a factor and others that say not. So we could throw them all together and perhaps actually get some resolution out of this. It increases the statistical power because, again, you're adding multiple studies and lots of numbers that somehow the sample size gets taken into account, and it improves your precision. And then you can extrapolate better to general populations. And this is considered an evidence-based kind of a resource. Now, here's the disadvantage. If you go in and pick your studies, cherry pick without adhering to a clear process, you can bias what studies you put in there. And that was very good because Joost and I had very different opinions about the effect of what some of these predictors are going to be. For instance, I believe that, and you'll see why, water temperature doesn't have a role because I did a study on that. And he believed that water temperature has a role because he and his Dutch buddies did a study on it that showed it did. So it was great that we were paired up to do this so that we could, if you will, cancel each other's bias out or make sure all the biases got put on the table. It's terribly time-consuming, as I've alluded to, and we had to throw out a lot of studies. So that are possibly people in this room whose studies weren't included. I got emails from people saying, hey, how come you didn't include my study when we presented this at ILCOR? And they had a chance to look at, give input. And it's because they didn't meet the criteria. And then, as I said, it requires advanced statistical knowledge, expertise, and that's where you outsource. And I have always made it my business to work with people smarter than I. Let's go to look now at what we found. And I'll start with the water temperatures because I just showed you how we were able to identify really only 3 studies. One appeared in both of these, looking at dividing the groups into, the analyses into 2 separate groups. One, we saw that some studies presented their data so that we could compare outcomes of people who were submerged in water that was less than 6 to 8 degrees centigrade. with studies, and obviously those studies then also compared those who had greater than 6 to 8 degrees centigrade. Then there are other studies that provided data where they said, no, we're going to define cold, instead of very cold, as less than or greater than 15 to 17 degrees centigrade. And so here is what these studies showed. So I'm going to show you how to look at this. This is what the meta-analysis does. It's kind of cool because it's visual. It's a real graphic, clear graphic analysis. So if we look at how do I do that? No. Yes. Okay. Laser pointer. All right. So here's the study from the Netherlands that Joost is involved with. Dr. Kieboom did. Now, this is a weird population. This only was reporting on children who had had cardiac arrest following drowning. And as I said, they didn't report the estimated water temperatures except to say we pulled out all the patients who drowned in the winter where we know our waters around the Netherlands is less than 6 to 8 degrees. And so this point here represents the relative risk, which means, since it's greater than 1, which is this dividing line, the likelihood is more than 1 that, in fact, they're going to have a good outcome. All right? But the confidence intervals, which represent this whole bar, are pretty wide, but it's a positive study. All right. Then, on the other hand, this is the study that I did, taking my drowning database, which had 1,094 patients, which included everybody who drowned in open water, whether they went to hospital, were just seen by EMS, or went directly to the medical examiners, coroners. So it included everybody, very different population. And we showed that in this large sample, the cold water, very cold water, was not predictive of a good outcome. It did not predict a good outcome. And we had pretty tight confidence intervals because we had such a large number of patients. So we had this shows conflicting results of the two studies that were available. And you might say, oh, that's a very small number of studies, isn't it? So what do you do with that information? So I want you to be thinking now, when we get to the 10 minutes of talk, how you're going to use this information. Are you going to continue to say, if it's cold water in Iceland, I'm going to go for an hour and a half, as the Tipton group recommended, or am I going to not because of this Quan study? Or am I going to believe in my neighbors from Amsterdam that it is a good predictor? And the same thing happened basically when we looked at at defining cold as just cold at 15, a cutoff of 15 to 17 degrees. Again, the Quan study showed no favorable effect of cold water, and another study that was this one was from Sweden, again a cardiac arrest study, showed a somewhat positive protective effect of cold water, but look at that confidence interval, it goes way over, and so isn't really very, very impressive. Okay, so that was a very concerning issue for the people at ILCOR. You could have heard a pin drop in the room when we presented that data, because so many people there believe that water temperature made a difference, but the evidence is conflicting and not very good to support it. All right, I'll just show you briefly this one of does salt water make a difference, because there's slightly more studies there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 studies that were found. And again, you can see if we look at the relative risk down here. Oh, nice. Almost all, they all stay on the positive side of 1, so they all look like they're fairly predictive of a favorable outcome, but really it's a pretty small effect, and then you can decide, are you going to make any policy change or decisions if William is lifeguarding against his better judgment in fresh water, that he's going to make a decision about making a rescue versus a salt water because the outcome might be slightly different, like means slightly less good. Is that clinically relevant or useful? All right. Now, here's the age one. Ooh, what do you think? Look at this. Here we had a lot of studies. There were 12 studies, and involving lots of patients, and from really all over the world. We have some from Japan, we have some, of course, from Germany and the United States, and even and Denmark. So there's quite good representation from, and over time. Look at this, from 1979, Orlowski's original study that said, gee, actually, less than 3-year-old, that was the cutoff he used, which is why we had to go to that using a cutoff of 3 to 6 years of age as at the lower end. He showed actually there was no protective value of age. But look at how many studies showed there was no protective value of age. Actually, quite a few. But we've continued to believe in our mythology about age. So age, in fact, when you look at it all, here are 2 that look as if age is providing a protective effect. But look at how wide the confidence intervals, and this one, it crosses way over, so we can say that study's not very significant, not significant at all. So there are really very few studies that show age matters. So if there is an effect from age, it is very small. Then we looked at EMS response time, since two centers, these are of course EMS systems, responding with their response time less than or greater than 9 minutes, and they showed that a response time of less than 9 minutes was associated with a favorable outcome, but again, these crossed over to less than 1, and so of questionable, still insignificant meaning. Now, this is the one that was the hardest of all. And many of you believe in submersion duration, and I want you to tell me why you believe it, because there are so many in this room who don't believe that you can trust that number that people tell you about submersion duration. Where do we get that submersion duration information from? Who's collecting it? It can vary, right? It's sometimes a bystander giving it to you. Sometimes it's EMS. Oh, but they kind of fudge it. They're getting it from the bystander, if there is one. And a lot of the time, it's missing. So despite that, if we go back to the oldest studies in here, and I'm sorry, this is pretty small, but the oldest studies actually go back to the 70s, which were pediatric ICU studies. The pediatric ICUs in the American South, Florida, Texas, were the first ones to start writing about drowning outcomes, because we drown children like flies in our residential pools in the United States, and haven't ever been as smart as New Zealand and Australia to try to limit that. So we continue to do it, as Kev was saying. But what they were reporting back then in the late 70s, early 80s, 90s, was that age actually did not seem to provide a protective effect. And in fact, look at this. When you look at submersion durations of less than 5 to 6 minutes, whoa, they're all showing that submersion duration does, I'm sorry, have I been confused? That submersion duration does make an effect, and so submersion duration does matter. And then when we took the studies that talked about short submersion durations of 10 to 11 minutes, they similarly showed that submersion durations of less than 10 minutes mattered in improving outcomes. And then when we looked at studies that made a cutoff of short submersion durations of being less than 15 or 25 minutes, they too continued to show that less than 15 to 25 minutes of submersion duration made a difference. So in other words, all these studies have shown that submersion duration makes a difference, although we have continued to say that doesn't matter because we don't believe the bystander. We don't believe the parent who's there telling us that information. And yet physiologically it makes tremendous sense because we know what drowning is. It's anoxia. And so the duration of anoxia is a determinant. And in fact, the parent is able to say that short periods of anoxia, they're pretty right about it. They're able to say, yeah, it was short. It was either maybe less than 5 or less than 10 or maybe less than 15, but in fact, it turns out to be a reliable predictor. And in fact, the most reliable predictor of all we looked at. So the ILCOR recommendation was this, that submersion durations of less than 10 minutes were associated with very high chance of favorable outcome, and that submersion durations of greater than 25 minutes were associated with a low chance of favorable outcomes. But that age, EMS response time, fresh or salt water, water temperature, and witness status were not, at this time, appearing to be useful predictors. And that submersion in ice-cold water may prolong the window of survival, and this is all hunch, not based on evidence, and justify extended search and rescue activities. That was a caveat that was thrown in. So now I'm going to ask you to consider how will you use this data. First of all, I'd like to make the case that all future predictor studies have to control for submersion duration. You cannot tell me that your ICU with its newest toy ventilator system, bypass, whatever it is, cooling, with EMS, pre-hospital cooling, or whatever you're doing is making a difference that I'm going to be believing unless you control for submersion duration. Because maybe you're treating, as Kahn did back in the 70s when Kahn first started writing about, gee, hypothermia is really good because we've had patients who have survived coma up here in Toronto. He was writing about his patients in Toronto as opposed to all of the folks down in Florida who were writing about their kids down in the warm waters of Florida. So he was saying that this is why cold water protects. And so this led to this continued belief, of course, for which there is some physiologic support, but really not a lot of clinical evidence to support at this time. So we should not accept univariate studies anymore. We have to be smarter now when we do our analyses and when we interpret these predictors. So the question to you, should we revise Dr. Tipton's group's recommendations? Were they overly permissive? He didn't like that term, but I thought it was terrifically diplomatic. Should we continue to deal with these predictors at just an individual level, let every lifeguard make his or her decision? Should we be making some decisions at system level so we don't send the Sikorsky out every time? So those are the questions I have for you all, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.